The gymnasium at Maplewood Elementary looked like something out of a magazine spread. Crepe paper streamers, in gold and white, twisted across the ceiling. Balloon arches framed the entrance. A catering table ran the full length of the far wall, loaded with sandwiches cut into triangles, fruit skewers, miniature cupcakes with fondant decorations, and a 3-tiered birthday cake covered in edible glitter that probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. Every detail was deliberate. Every detail was perfect, and in the middle of all of it, a small girl sat completely alone at a round table near the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching other children play a game she had not been invited to join. Her name was Abby. She had just turned 9 years old. She was wearing a dress the color of a summer sky, and she had a paper crown on her head that was already starting to tilt to one side. She didn't fix it. She just sat there, very still, watching. Across the room her mother was laughing at something a man in a sport coat said. She had a glass of sparkling water in one hand and her phone in the other, and she was nodding in the practiced way people nod when they are technically listening, but mostly performing the act of listening. Around her stood 4 or 5 other adults. Colleagues, mostly, and 2 women from the school board, who had apparently been on the invitation list, for reasons that had less to do with Abby's birthday, and more to do with optics. Nobody had intended for the party to go this way. That was the thing. Nobody had planned for it to become what it became. But plans made by people who are very busy, and very competent, and very used to outsourcing emotion to logistics, have a way of drifting from what they meant to be. A man standing near the gymnasium door noticed Abby before almost anyone else did. His name was Robert Callahan. He was 41 years old, a high school science teacher from Barrie, Ontario, who had driven 2 hours that morning to bring his son to a birthday party for a girl his son barely knew. They were in the same class, Abby and his son Felix. Felix had been invited because he sat next to Abby at the back of the room, and because Abby, according to Felix, was actually pretty smart and doesn't talk too much, which was the highest compliment Felix gave anyone. Robert had planned to drop Felix off, find a coffee shop nearby, and pick him up in 2 hours. That had been the plan. But the weather had turned. Early November in central Ontario has a way of doing that. And the parking lot outside was already glazed with the first freezing rain of the season, so he'd stayed. He'd found a folding chair near the back of the room, and sat with his jacket still on, scrolling through nothing on his phone. Half watching the room the way adults do, when they are somewhere they don't quite belong. That was when he saw Abby. He watched for a few minutes first, the way you watch something and keep expecting it to change on its own. He looked around the room for whichever adult was supposed to be sitting with her. He checked twice. Then he looked at the cake on the table in front of her, untouched, the candles not yet lit, and he looked at Abby's face, and something in his chest quietly shifted. Robert Callahan knew that look. He had seen it from the inside. He stood up, crossed the room, and stopped at the edge of her table. "Is anyone sitting here?" he asked. Abby looked up. She blinked. It was the look of a child who had stopped expecting to be spoken to. "No," she said. "Mind if Felix and I join you? He's been trying to convince me the cupcakes over there are better than the cake, and I told him he was wrong, but I don't actually have any evidence." Abby glanced at Felix, who had materialized beside his father, with the specific energy of a child who has been eating sugar for 40 minutes and is now ready for a project. "The cupcakes have sprinkles," Felix said seriously. "Cake doesn't have sprinkles, therefore cupcakes." Abby looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's not how therefore works." Felix considered this. "Okay, but the sprinkles are still real." And Abby laughed. It was small and quick, like she was a little surprised by it herself, but it was real. Robert pulled out a chair and sat down, and Felix climbed into the one next to Abby, like he had been sitting there all afternoon, and that was how it started. With a wrong syllogism about sprinkles, and a kid who didn't know to be awkward about it. To understand what it meant for Robert Callahan to cross that gymnasium floor, you have to understand something about the 18 months that came before it. His wife, Claire, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer in the spring of Felix's first-grade year. She was 38 years old. She was a landscape architect who spent her weekends redesigning their backyard, and her evenings reading crime novels and her Tuesday mornings volunteering at a food bank 2 blocks from their house. Because she said it kept her from taking things for granted. She was funny in a dry, sideways way that took people a few minutes to catch up to. She made terrible coffee and refused to acknowledge it. She cried at nature documentaries, but not at sad movies, which she said was because animals didn't know they were being filmed. She died 14 months after her diagnosis, on a Thursday afternoon in late September, while Felix was at school, and Robert was holding her hand in a hospital room in Barrie, that smelled like antiseptic, and the Lilacs he brought, every week, even when she couldn't smell them anymore. Felix was 7 years old. He asked, when Robert picked him up from school that day, if Mom was going to be home for dinner. Robert sat in the school parking lot for 11 minutes before he could answer. The year that followed was the kind of year that doesn't get talked about much. Not the acute grief. People have language for that. They bring casseroles and say the right things and show up in the first month. It's the months after that that go quiet. The months when the casseroles stop coming, and the calls thin out, and you are still very much in the middle of it, but the world has largely decided you should be further along by now. Robert taught his classes. He helped Felix with reading homework. He learned to braid hair badly. Felix had a phase of wanting a ponytail, and Robert's attempts were the subject of gentle mockery from the other parents at school pickup for 3 months. He kept the house more or less standing. He did not for a very long time do much else. He was not depressed in the clinical sense. He was just narrowed. His world had contracted to what was necessary, and he had not yet found his way back to what was else. He almost didn't come to the party at all. Felix had been excited about it, which was reason enough, but Robert had a habit of volunteering to sit in parking lots, rather than walk into rooms where he didn't know many people. Somewhere in the grief, he had become someone who found social rooms harder than he used to. He didn't like that about himself. He hadn't figured out how to fix it yet. The freezing rain fixed it for him, in a sideways sort of way. Back at the table, Felix had decided that the most important thing was to establish definitively whose party this was. "It's your birthday," he said to Abby, as though confirming a legal fact. "Yes," Abby said. "So you should get the first piece of cake. That's the rule." "There isn't a rule about that." "There absolutely is a rule about that. Dad, tell her." "He's right," Robert said. "It's one of the older rules. Goes back centuries." Abby looked at him with the specific skepticism of a 9-year-old who suspects she is being teased but isn't entirely sure. "Does it actually?" "Probably not," Robert admitted, "but it should." That got a real smile this time. Not the polite kind, the kind that reaches the eyes. Robert asked her what kind of cake it was. She said lemon. He said lemon was underrated, and most people didn't appreciate it properly. She agreed with a certainty that suggested this was a hill she had been waiting to defend. Felix said lemon cake was fine, I guess, which both of them received with appropriate disappointment. They talked about her class, about the science fair that was coming up in January, about whether the new indoor gym equipment was actually better than the old stuff, or just newer. Felix showed her something on his tablet, a video of a dog learning to use a keyboard that he had apparently been saving for the right audience, and Abby watched it twice, and declared it the best thing she'd seen all week, which was by Felix's standards, extremely high praise. Robert mostly listened. He asked questions when things slowed down, the small calibrated questions of someone who had spent years in classrooms. Learning that the best thing you can do for a person who has gone quiet is make the next thing easy for them to say. He didn't perform interest. He was interested. At some point, Abby's mother drifted by the table with her glass of water, and the distracted quality of someone who has just remembered that something requires attention. She smiled at Robert and at Felix with the brisk warmth of someone who is used to charming people efficiently. "Abby, are you having fun, sweetheart?" "Yes," Abby said. "Good." Her mother's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. "I'll be right back, okay? The Hendersons just arrived." She was gone before the sentence finished landing. Abby looked back at the table. Felix was already describing the science fair project he was planning. Something involving magnetism and a skateboard that Robert privately suspected was going to be both ambitious and catastrophically unstable. And Abby leaned forward slightly to hear better, and the paper crown on her head tilted another degree to the left, and she still didn't fix it. Robert noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He just quietly reached over, straightened it gently, and went back to listening to Felix explain the physics of magnetic skateboard propulsion, as though they were perfectly sound. Abby was very still for a moment after that. Then she went back to listening to Felix too. Her name was Sandra Kowalski, and by most external measures, she was doing an excellent job. She was 44 years old, a senior director at a mid-sized healthcare consulting firm in Toronto, and she had built that career with the particular intensity of someone who had learned early that competence was the most reliable thing to stand on when everything else shifted. She had grown up in Sudbury, the daughter of a nurse and a foreman at a nickel processing plant, and she had gotten out on scholarships and sheer application, and she was proud of that. Rightly so. She had married relatively late, at 36, a man named James who worked in urban planning, and made her laugh, and had strong opinions about public transit, and the best route to the cottage. They had Abby 3 years later, which had been a difficult pregnancy, and a difficult birth, and a daughter that Sandra had looked at in the delivery room, and felt something she had no prior vocabulary for. James died of a heart attack at 41. No warning. A Tuesday morning in February, walking from the parking garage to his office. He was 41 years old, and he had a half-eaten granola bar in his coat pocket when the paramedics arrived, and Sandra had learned that details at some point, and had never been able to unknow it. Abby was 4 when it happened. She had no clear memory of her father now, only the sense of him, a presence, a warmth, the specific timbre of a voice she could almost but not quite recall. Sandra had done what she knew how to do. She had organized, she had planned, she had hired the right people, and kept the right schedules, and maintained the career that kept them financially stable, and enrolled Abby in good schools. And ensured that Abby wanted, for nothing that could be purchased or arranged, what she had not done. And this was not cruelty, it was not indifference, it was the specific failure of someone whose emotional vocabulary had always been more narrow than her professional one. Was slow down enough to ask what Abby actually needed, not in terms of activities and appointments and parties with imported dessert tables. In terms of presence, attention. The unscheduled, unoptimized, unhurried kind. She had looked at her daughter from across that gymnasium many times in the past hour. She had told herself everything was fine, the party was beautiful, Abby was fed, and dressed, and celebrated in a room full of people. It was when she looked over near the window and saw a man she didn't know straightening her daughter's paper crown, without making a production of it, and saw Abby go very still, and then saw her daughter lean forward toward a boy who was talking enthusiastically about skateboards. It was in that moment that Sandra Kowalski, who prided herself on clear assessment of situations, understood something she had been misassessing for quite some time. She stood with her water glass, and felt the particular cold of a recognition that cannot be unfelt. The cake, when it was finally cut, caused a minor controversy, because Felix maintained that the birthday girl should get the corner piece with the most icing, and the catering staff had a protocol about this, and Felix was not interested in the protocol. Robert intervened diplomatically. The corner piece went to Abby. Felix accepted a consolation cupcake with visible dignity. Abby ate her cake with the focused pleasure of someone who hadn't eaten much that afternoon. Between bites she told Robert that her favorite subject was math, which she liked because it was fair, meaning it either worked or it didn't, and there was no arguing about it. He said he taught science for similar reasons. She said she found science interesting, but sometimes the explanations got too long. He said that was a fair critique of science communication, and he would pass it along. Felix had, by this point, made tentative friends with 2 other kids at a nearby table, and was running a negotiation about whether to play a card game or watch something on someone's tablet. He kept drifting back to check on Abby with the instinctive loyalty of a child whose father had modeled decency without ever naming it as such. Robert asked Abby what she'd wished for when they lit the candles. She looked at him sideways. "You're not supposed to tell," she said. "You're right. I take it back." A pause. Then she said, quieter, "I wished that next year it would just be small, like just a few people I actually know." Robert nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment. "That sounds like a good wish," he said finally. Sandra appeared at the table not long after the cake was cut. She sat down across from Abby, her phone face down on the table for the first time all afternoon, and she was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone composing themselves. She thanked Robert for sitting with Abby. She said it simply, without the brisk efficiency she'd used earlier. It was a different register entirely. Robert said it was genuinely his pleasure, and he meant it. Sandra looked at her daughter. Did you have a good birthday, Bug? Abby considered the question with the seriousness she gave to things that mattered. The last part was good, she said. Sandra nodded slowly. Yeah, she said, I think it was. Robert Callahan drove home on the 400, in light freezing rain, with Felix asleep in the back seat and the heater running, and the radio on low. He was thinking about Claire. He thought about her most drives home from things, in the particular way you carry someone. Not with the sharp ache of the early months, but with a quieter weight, like something you've learned to walk with. He thought about how she would have handled that gymnasium. Probably very differently than he had. She would have known more people, would have moved more easily through the room. But she would have noticed Abby too. He was certain of that. It was one of the things he had loved about her. She had a low tolerance for people being invisible. He thought about Sandra Kowalski, and the way she had sat down at that table, and put her phone face down, and something in him recognized it as a significant thing. Small as it looked from the outside. He thought about Felix, who had presented an entirely wrong logical argument, about sprinkles to a girl he barely knew, and made her laugh inside of 2 minutes. He reached over and turned the radio down a little further, and just drove. The following Monday, Abby came into class, with a drawing she had made over the weekend. It was a birthday cake, 3 tiers, covered in what was recognizably edible glitter, rendered in orange crayon, because that was apparently the closest she had to gold, and in the corner she had drawn 2 stick figures sitting at a table. One was clearly meant to be Felix, because it had a large triangular piece of cake, and was surrounded by small circles that were probably sprinkles. The other was taller, wearing what appeared to be a winter jacket. She gave it to Felix without ceremony, the way children give things when they mean them, and don't want to make it strange. Felix brought it home. Robert found it on the kitchen table that evening, and he looked at it for a long time. He put it on the refrigerator, next to Felix's school photo, and a grocery list, and a drawing of a lighthouse that Felix had made in 2nd grade. It fit there, between all those ordinary things, like it had always been part of the collection. Sandra called the firm's event coordinator that week, and cancelled 2 standing obligations that had been creeping into weekends. She started leaving the office by 5:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She didn't announce this or frame it as a transformation. She just started doing it, quietly, and used that time to pick Abby up from school, instead of relying on the aftercare program. The first Tuesday, Abby got in the car and looked mild surprised at us, then said, "Did something happen?" "Nothing happened," Sandra said. "I just wanted to get you." Abby looked out the window. After a minute she said, "Can we stop and get hot chocolate?" "Yes," Sandra said. They stopped and got hot chocolate. They sat in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons on Wellington Street, and Sandra asked Abby about her day. And this time she listened with her phone in her bag, and both hands around her cup. Abby talked about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate, about the rules of a game. She talked about a book she was reading. She talked about Felix, who had apparently given a presentation about his magnetic skateboard theory, that had prompted their teacher to say it was creative, in a tone that Abby found suspicious. Sandra listened. She laughed at the right moments. She asked follow-up questions. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even particularly remarkable, from the outside. It was just a mother and her daughter in a parking lot, with hot chocolate, in November, talking. But Abby fell asleep that night, without the particular restlessness Sandra had noticed in her for longer than she wanted to admit. And when Sandra checked on her before her own bedtime, and stood in the doorway of her daughter's room in the dark, she felt something loosen in her chest. Something she had been holding without realizing it. She had been providing for Abby for years. She had not, or not nearly enough, been present for her. It was not an easy thing to know about yourself. It was, however, a useful one. Robert and Felix ran into Sandra and Abby at the farmers' market in mid-December, which in Barrie in December is an indoor affair with a lot of preserves and hand-knit things, and a man who makes very good cider. Felix and Abby immediately formed a coalition about whether the cinnamon buns were worth the line, which they were. Robert and Sandra stood nearby with their cider, and talked in the way of people who don't know each other well but have, through some specific moment, already past the stage of small talk. She asked him how long he'd been in Barrie. He said 6 years, originally from Hamilton. She said she'd grown up north of there, in Sudbury. He said he'd never spent much time in Sudbury. She said most people hadn't, and that was their loss, because it had its own particular beauty if you knew where to look. She asked about teaching. He talked about it honestly, the parts that were exhausting, and the parts that still surprised him, and the student he'd had 3 years ago, who had struggled all year, and then sent him an email last spring to say she'd gotten into nursing school, which had genuinely been one of the better days of recent memory. She listened the way she had listened to Abby in the parking lot, really listened. They talked for longer than either of them had planned to. Felix and Abby finished their cinnamon buns, and came back and made it known, through the specific body language of children who have been patient long enough, that it was time to move on to the next thing. Robert and Sandra exchanged numbers. For school scheduling purposes, they said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and both of them knew that, and neither of them said so, and it was fine. Abby's next birthday was in November of the following year. It was not in a gymnasium. It was in Sandra's backyard, which in November in Barrie required a heated tent and wool socks, and didn't care about either of those things. There were 12 people, 5 of Abby's actual friends from school, Sandra's sister, and her 2 kids who had driven down from North Bay, and Felix and Robert, who arrived with a lemon cake that Robert had made from scratch following a recipe he'd found, and then significantly modified, the modifications being of debatable improvement. Abby received the cake with the seriousness of a person conducting an official assessment. "It's good," she said finally. "High praise," Robert said. "The icing is a little uneven, very fair, but the lemon part is right, I'll take it." There was a fire in the outdoor fire pit and somebody had brought a Bluetooth speaker, and there were blankets piled on the lawn chairs, and the kids ran between the warmth of the tent and the cold of the yard in the way children do when they have stopped thinking about temperature entirely. Sandra stood near the fire pit with a mug of something warm, and watched her daughter race across the frozen grass, and laugh at something Felix said, and she thought about a gymnasium a year ago, and a paper crown, tilting to one side, and the specific loneliness of being surrounded by everything, except what you needed. She thought about all the things that had quietly changed, and how many of them had started with such a small thing. A man pulling out a chair at an empty table, and asking a wrong question about sprinkles in the right tone of voice. She looked over at Robert, who was being lectured by Abby about the structural integrity of the cake layers, and was taking notes on his phone with complete sincerity, and Sandra Kowalski, who was not by nature a sentimental person, felt something that she recognized, after a moment, as gratitude. Not the polished kind, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it already knows where it lives. Abby did not sit alone for a single moment that night. Not even close. And when they sang Happy Birthday and the candles lit up her face in the cold dark air of the yard, she closed her eyes to make her wish, and whatever she wished for, she was smiling before she even blew them out. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. Some changes don't make the news. They just happen in backyards and parking lots, and across gymnasium floors, carried by people who noticed, who crossed the room anyway, who asked the small question that changed the whole evening. That's usually how it works, if you pay attention.